Welcome back, book nerds. This is Library Card, the show for people who want to think deeply about what they're reading and get inspired to read more. I'm Megan Gliona. I'm here with Brian Brinkman and RJB, and it's January when we're recording. New year, new start, but I still have kind of that end of year hangover. I'm still thinking a lot about my end of year book lists and movie lists. It's award season. Everybody's thinking about kind of the best of 2024. And we've been thinking a lot about ranking within art and kind of how it's useful and how it's viewed and criticized. We all keep ranked lists, some of us more than others. Brian, I'm looking at you. And I've recently started keeping ranked lists, mostly because of you two. And I would love to hear kind of what you think about ranking in art and what it serves both of you.
Well, I'll go first because I rank everything. I rank the meals I had each day. I rank the minutes of a movie that I watched to determine which was the most impact. No, I'm joking. I mean, I think it's pretty simple for me. I grew up in the 90s and I read a lot of like Rolling Stone magazine and Entertainment Weekly to, understand culture at large and to know what was going on in the literary world, the music world, in the book world, or in the movie world. And one of my favorite issues of both magazines that would come out at the end of every year was their best of, and so they would count down and it was 1 to 10, and there were some honorable mentions and a nice little blurb about why they put it there. And for me, it was always helpful to just garner someone's perspective on something. It was fun to debate. It was fun to be like, wait, you put that number 3 and that number 6, that is way wrong. There's just like a fun discourse element to it. And I think that over time, it's become a way for me to best organize like how I feel about the art that I consume and I exist with. And then also the debate aspect of it. I love almost more than actually consuming an album or a movie or a book. I love talking about it with people. And I love the idea that like, well, this really moved me. And I have this at number 13 on my list. And the reason why it's number 13 is because of blah, 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 versus number 12. And if you go up a little bit higher, these are the records that really meant that much more to me. And this is why. I think that you have to recognize the subjectivity of it and the lightness to it. There is no such thing as a definitive objective list of this is greater than this.
What?
It's all just your perspective. There's not. There never
Really?
will be. I would agree. No, sorry. The goal at the end of the rainbow, or the pot of gold, is not waiting for us. It's all about the rainbow itself.
Wow. Wow.
So in conclusion, it's all about organization and discourse for me. And I don't think people should take lists too seriously. I think that they should make them if they like them and not make them if they don't like them, and just share in conversation based around art one way or the other. RJ, Megan, what are your guys' thoughts on this?
RJ, what about you?
I think I've talked to a lot of musicians about genre, and I feel like it's kind of a similar thing. Like a lot of musicians who, to me, clearly play within a specific genre of music do not like to be like categorized in any genre. And I think that's like, I guess my main takeaway in that is like, to them, it's just the thing that they do, But I think for like fans and consumers of it, like Brian said, it's, classification and organization, which obviously is like, it's natural to us as humans. But I kind of think it's like unfair to the artists, but I think it's also necessary to the art consumers. Like, I think for the reasons Brian laid out, it's really like helpful to have a list of the, top albums, top books, top movies. I do think, looking at my like 2024 books list, maybe like in ranking in general, and I think we've talked about this before, maybe with shows or tours or something, maybe there should be like tiers. You know what I mean? Like, I know Brian does that with some of the shows.
Yeah, Brian likes
like, it's
tiers.
Like, instead of like, this is the number one, like numbers 1 through 5 or 6, it's kind of like the summer tour from last year where we were drafting. There was like a group of 5 or 6 shows that were all like the top tier.
Right. So it should be like tier 1, tier 2, tier 3,
Yeah, well,
as
it's just
opposed
like
to like, Mhm, I
feels a
get it.
little bit extreme to be like, this is the number one, whatever, even though I do it all the time. We all do it. So I don't know. I also wonder if like to artists, it feels, I wonder if it makes them feel bad
God,
to be ranked,
if anybody was
you know?
putting anything I made on any list, I'd be so fucking happy. So I don't know. I mean,
What if you were ranked the number 3 host of HF Pod?
I probably am already.
I mean,
So I'm
she's the
fine
number
with
one
that.
drafter.
Yeah, right.
I don't
Tied
know.
now.
Megan, you're the artist. What do you, is it
Yeah,
unfair?
hardly. Well, I think of it in 2 different reasons. The reason I rank is and have started to, which has definitely been influenced by both of you, is it's for me, it's been a way to think more academically about what I'm reading and consuming. And also I'm listening more carefully. And it's just encouraged me to like engage deeper and think critically. I think for a long time I was reading books and listening to music and not really thinking about them critically, which is fine, which is amazing and almost a gift. I miss that sometimes. But I wasn't remembering anything. And this has been a way for me to really remember. And the other aspect is this idea of the archival, which I've become kind of obsessed with through an artistic lens. And that's this idea of how we hold on to things, whether it's memories or feelings or pieces of art we're consuming. And having a list of what was your favorite from a year is an incredible capture of a moment in time. You look at this list and you think, like, I've always kept the book list for books I read every year, and I haven't ranked them in the past, but I have them. And you look at them and you think, oh, I was reading that. I was thinking about that. That's what was going on for me then. I feel like that's so huge with music and with books. And so for me, it's also about that idea of archival and capturing a moment in time. So it's not necessarily about what's better or worse, but also just what hits me the deeply. And I don't know. I don't really think it matters. Like, I think whether it's fair or not, like, you put your art in the world, people get to do whatever they want with it. And
Yeah.
that is, you know, what is both beautiful and scary about art. But if you're lucky enough to make art, it doesn't matter what happens to it after that.
That's true.
Like, if anybody's seeing your art, like, you're so lucky. So that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, maybe the categorization point I made earlier is not exactly the same as what you're saying. Because I do think like, like
So you're thinking
Let-
about like if people are like in a genre, I don't want to be just a jazz musician, or I don't want
yeah.
like that.
But if
Yeah.
I was like, hey Brian, you should go check out this artist, and then Brian was like, what kind of music is it? And I'm like, well, it's like a little bit of everything. Brian would be like, well, that's a little I can't what am I
Right,
supposed to
right,
do with
right.
that? Right. So like, but I do think ranking and
Right.
organizing, it does the same, kind of helps in the same way. Because people ask me, what's the best book you read last year? I'm going to go into like a long academic statement about how I don't,
Yeah.
how ranking is subjective. I'm going to say it was the Bee Sting. You should read it.
It was the fucking Bee Sting. It's great. I made a podcast about it. You should listen to it.
I think also, and I think about this specifically with movies and albums that are a little bit easier for me to consume multiple times rather than books. Like, you're usually getting like the one read from me of that book. I'm not really going to go back and like reread to see if my ranking was correct. One thing I really like, and Meg, you talked about this from like an archival standpoint. If I have like a list of my favorite movies of a given decade and 5 years goes by and I watch one of them and it was, lower on the list, but like in that moment it hit me really hard. It gives me an opportunity to reconsider, what am I looking for from a movie, or what am I really looking for from an album, because perhaps at a certain point in my life it didn't hit me the way that the director or the actors would have intended it to, or the artist would have intended it to. And one of the cool things about art is that you can consistently be proven wrong in a way that later on you revisit. And wrong in quotes, similar to like best in quotes. This idea that this didn't really land with me, it landed with you. And now I go back at a different point in my life with different perspective, and I can revisit this and say, oh my God, now I totally get this in a completely different way. And it hits you a little bit harder. So I think it's more like what you're saying, Meg, from an organizational standpoint. It just allows you the opportunity to see, I watched that, I read that, I listened to that. This is where it is for me right now. In the future, this could change. And that's kind of the point of, consuming this and then reconsuming all of this, at large, I would say.
Yeah, well, that's one of my favorite things that you do on Beyond the Pond. If people don't know, Brian has a really great music podcast called Beyond the Pond, and you look at your lists from 5-10 years before and think about what your favorite albums were, and if you're still listening to them. And I always think, oh, I wish I had that, because it's so interesting to think back about who you were at those times and how things have stayed with you or not stayed with you. So ranked lists are great for that.
I'm actually going to do that at some point this year. I'm going to reread my favorite book of all time, East of Eden, for the first time in 12
I love
years.
that book so much. Oh my God, I love that book.
I'm very curious how it hits 12
Yeah.
years later. TBD.
It's going to be different. That's for sure.
It's going to
That's the
be
thing.
really, really different. And I did that recently, so I'm excited to talk to you guys about that too. Well, maybe that's a really good transition. Let's transition into what we're reading right now. And can I start? Because I think it kind of builds on what we were
Please.
just talking about.
Please do it.
So I reread 100 Years of Solitude, and I read it when I was in my 20s. I don't remember exactly how old I was, but I remember the only things I remembered about it was that it blew me away, and it was really incredibly challenging. And I just finished it, and it is such a masterpiece. It's about, RJ, I know you've read it. You haven't read it, right, Brian?
I have not read it. This is on my ongoing list of books I have to read.
Well, the reason it's so great is because it's about these humongous themes, like the way that history repeats itself, which is something I know that you love, how we're doomed to our fate, how romantic love both ruins us and also gives us reason for existence, and just so many incredible themes. And it was really interesting reading back because I focused and really read a lot of it in a short amount of time. And it takes so much effort because everybody has the same name. Like all the men are named one of two names, and it's really, really confusing. But once you've kind of pushed back past that, the first half of the book is a lot about the Colombian Civil War. And so there's a lot of focus on the men and the fighting and the not the fighting of the war itself, but how it impacts this one family. But then the second half of the book it's not just focused on the women, but it feels like it is, because everything starts to condense down and the family becomes smaller and the whole kind of universe becomes smaller. And it's the most beautiful, magical, incredible universe that you get to be absorbed into. And that's why I love Marquez. He's one of my all-time favorite writers. But being able to reread it where I am now and the type of reader I am now, it was such a gift. So I definitely push that one up your list. I stand by this recommendation, unlike other recommendations that I've been criticized for. This one I feel really strongly about, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it. And RJ, you should reread it again so we can talk about it. But right now I'm also reading a totally different book, also large in scope. This is recommended by Brian Brinkman, These Truths by Jill Lepore. Brian, I know this was one of your favorite books last year, right? Your top 5 books.
I think this was my number 3 last year. I love this
Number
book
3.
so much.
Incredible. I'm only 100 pages in, so it's American history book. John Adams and Alexander Hamilton have just been introduced to us, so that's where we are. But I'm already taken by her writing. She's poetic and effortless to read, and really creates a sense of, she really allows you to get completely absorbed in where you are in the history without it feeling really heavy and taxing. And I don't read a lot of nonfiction. It's a huge weakness of mine. And this is a really great kind of pathway for me to read nonfiction. So I appreciate the recommendation, and I'll see how long it takes me to read. It's like 900 pages.
I'm glad you're enjoying it. I don't see it as a weakness. We all have our own interests. And I think the thing that she does so well that I'm curious your thoughts as you go along is she balances the ideals and what America searches for and tries to be with the harsh realities of what we've done and of the harsh compromises that we've made, and allows you as the reader to balance out how do you feel about those compromises and how do you feel about the ramifications of them. So obviously in the late 18th century, a lot of compromises still to come.
Yeah.
I'm very, very excited to hear how your thoughts are on our country and where we're at in the world right now upon concluding it.
Yeah, she's really good at balancing what's great about this country and what is not great. And I think that you have to hold both of those things. Yeah. So it's great so far. How about you, RJ? What are you reading now?
Well, I'm in the middle of a book that Megan recommended a while back, I think. I don't remember when it came up, Secret History, which is it's good. It's interesting. It's very dense, like in a way that is good and immersive. But it's really it's pretty interesting. I guess it was written a while ago, right? It's not.
It's
It's
an
it's
old
like in the
book, yeah.
90s.
I read it a
Yeah.
long time ago. Donna Tartt, who wrote The Goldfinch. This is better than Goldfinch, though, but such a deep sense of place in that book.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
being in this college and just completely in this academic space. Like, yeah, I was completely taken by that book.
Yeah, it's really good. I'm reading that. The two books I read before that were both pretty short and not good, so I'm excited to be reading a good book again. So thanks, Megan.
No problem. I got you. How about you, Brian? What are you reading?
Well, I'm balancing 3 books per usual at once. My fiction book is Long Island Compromise by Taffy Brodesser-Akner, who wrote Fleischman is in Trouble. Our good friend here on the podcast, RJB, recommended this. I'm getting Franzen vibes. I'm getting Bee Sting vibes. I'm totally immersed in a family that, like many families in the modern world, is quickly becoming detached from itself and reality while trying to hold firm to values and love while also questioning all those things and chasing down their careers. And there's major themes of, Judaism in the modern world and entertainment and sex and drugs and just, all the stuff that you want. And it just reads in the same way that, like, with the first time I read The Corrections by Franzen, it just like you're dropped into these scenes that are almost like purposefully mundane, but described in such a colorful way that you just cannot stop turning pages. So I've been loving that. My nonfiction right now, I'm reading Quentin Tarantino's Cinema Speculation, which I would recommend to anyone out there. I don't want to over recommend it. I'm just enjoying it, but it's Quentin Tarantino looking back on the 1970s as he was growing up in Los Angeles. His mom was a single mom and basically had a deal with him from the time he was 6 years old that he could go on dates with her and various boyfriends as long as he acted cool. And her favorite date was going to the movies. So from the age of 6, he was going into like PG-13 and R-rated movies and seeing stuff that he admits he should not have seen as a 6 and 7-year-old boy. But he was like absorbing it, and all of it led to his movies that have been coming out since the mid 1990s. And so every chapter is a different movie that had a massive impact on him at the time, and then 20 years later, 30 years later, impacted the way he made movies. So I've been reading it and then watching the movies that he describes. I did Bullet with Steve McQueen and Dirty Harry over the weekend, which both were outstanding, shot so incredibly, and like you can just see Tarantino dripping throughout it. So really, really cool book for anyone who wants to balance reading with film. And then finally, I'm listening to Alien Earths, which is an overview of the search for life on distant planets, specifically since the James Webb Telescope launched in 2021. It's slim, written. The president of the Sagan Society is writing it. Her personal story about how she came to this study of where life is in the cosmos, what we're up against, what we're looking for, how we still don't really know how life came to be on Earth, and so we're just in this like great big mystery. And it's a great complement to a book that we all read earlier this year, Orbital, in the sense of the majesty of the cosmos and the just stark loneliness we find ourselves in the universe right now.
Very cool. Very different. Did either of you read Fleischman is in Trouble?
I just watched the show, and that was my favorite
Yeah.
show I watched in 2022.
So I read the book and I did not like it. I loved the show. So I'm curious to see if her writing's changed at all. But I also think Fleischman, the characters were so annoying in the book. I think that they came across better on TV. I don't know how, but good actors maybe.
Yeah.
But the book was absolutely, I found it really annoying. But so I'm curious to see.
I will say that so far, the characters I've been introduced to are pretty annoying. I think that she has kind of a thing for that.
Yeah.
And as I'm reading it, like one note I will say is it does read like I wrote this book to sell it for a TV show. Like it reads like a television
Yeah.
show.
Well, she probably did, right?
I mean, I'm guessing after the success of Fleischman, that's kind of
Yeah.
where your head is. I'm really enjoying it though. I think that it kind of has that East Coast high-minded intellectualism that we all seem to crave.
Yeah, I'm gonna read it.
But
since you guys both like
it's sort of a satire of what you just described.
Sure. Yes.
Well, all of her
Right.
stuff is, right? It's kind of like a send out of that, like a, being like, this is what we are. Look at us. We're ridiculous, right? A little bit.
That's
Yeah.
the vibe. That's very
Mhm.
much the vibe.
Yeah.
I just want to tell you guys that if anyone was going to write a short story about a person who would become like a cult hero filmmaker whose movies are basically known for violence, extended dialogue, profanity, like you couldn't really come up with a better origin story than what you just said about Quentin
I know.
Tarantino. I mean, it's
I was
totally
thinking
right.
the exact same thing.
It's too good. Like
It's
what else
so
could he have
spot
done in
on.
his life? Like nothing.
Right?
It makes you realize like certain decisions are made for you before you ever get to decide where you want to go, how you want to
Yes,
invest your
that's
time.
fate. That's fate.
Right. And like 99.9% of kids are not raised in that world. And so like there's just it's total destiny.
But that totally like inspires me as a parent, because I feel like sometimes we're so worried about parenting now, about being right and doing the right thing for our kids and making sure everything's like age appropriated. I think we're holding back some of these creative geniuses from delving into stuff that, I don't know. I feel like that mom, like she just gave us Quentin Tarantino. Like that's incredible.
That's the thing. And he talks about how when he was in grade school, he was stealthily popular because he could tell kids, adult themes and about violence that none of them were being exposed to. We let our son watch Dune over the weekend, and his big takeaway at this point in his life was it's not that scary, which the fear isn't really the point in that
exactly.
movie. But I'm interested to talk more with him about it because I feel I try to think of that sort of standpoint of like, what can I introduce you to that's probably a little bit earlier than you should learn it, but will inspire you later on.
Well, I always think that, and this is a bit of a rabbit hole, but as a teacher and a parent, I always feel like there's extremes to this, of course, but in general, kids take what they take from things. And if they're not ready for them, they tend to go over their heads. So like I saw Dirty Dancing when I was 8. I didn't even know there was an abortion in that movie. Like I didn't even understand that was happening in that movie. It just goes over your head. You're just like, oh, they're going in to see a doctor. Okay. Like you just let it go. You don't understand. You just let it go. And I think that's really true. And I think we've held back a lot of that now in trying to protect children. And it's causing them to lose a lot of depth. And that's why they're reading shit graphic novels and watching crap cartoons. So there's my little soapbox and I'll stop there. They should just go to like really inappropriate movies instead.
I'm into it.
We're on a M. Night movie kick with our kids.
Oh yeah. Do they like those? God, The Village is so cool.
Yeah, they like them. They're like it's not that scary either, but
they're not scared.
They're at least no, not really, but they're at least watching movies, that are like somewhat interesting,
like decent movies. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I appreciate that, Brian, but I don't know. I don't know if my kids would watch Dune. Maybe I should try.
The movie is all expository. It's literally just telling you everything, and so it's easy for kids to follow. I think it's easier than I would have thought it was. He was totally enthralled.
Cool stuff to look at too, like cool costumes, cool settings.
Nobody takes off and lands spaceships like Denis Villeneuve. It is.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so into it.
That's awesome. I need to watch Dune too. All All right, before we get lost on a movie kick, let's get to what we're here to talk about today. We've, managed to spend 20 minutes, not there yet, which is kind of part of the course for us. But we are going to be discussing Northwoods by Daniel Mason today. And Daniel Mason is a novelist. He's a doctor. He's an assistant professor in psychiatry at Stanford. And he wrote this book, Northwoods. I think it's fifth or sixth novel of his, but this tells the story of a house and its occupants and the land that it sits on in Western Massachusetts over 4 centuries. The story is truly one of a kind. It's a collection of prose, of letters, of songs, poems, photographs, diary entries, botanical journals. I mean, the list goes on and on. It really bends form and genre. It's an engrossing tale of American history, humanity, the natural world, and the ephemeral. And I don't want to talk anymore about what it is in the intro because there's so much in it. It's so rich. It's so dense. I just want to dive right in. And I want to start with Brian. You brought this book to us. So what was it about this book that drew you in?
It's funny. I about 14, 15 months ago, as I was really getting back into reading on a pretty consistent basis, I was reading the New York Times review list on a pretty regular basis, and they were starting to put out their best of 2023 lists. And this was on the list, and the cover immediately got me, which is a illustration of a catamount in a natural setting. And I read about it, and similar to what you just gave us from an overview standpoint, Meg, I was like, the experimentation that seems to be going on here, the relationship to time and place, and how a place evolves over time, just sounded to me like something I was really, really into. I went to like 4 different bookstores though, and they did not have it at the end of 2023 and early 2024, which only made me want to seek it out that much more. So I ended up ordering it from a friend's bookshop in Nashville. Shout out to Novelet Bookstore. And I got it. I started it kind of at the perfect time of year. It was late March, that late winter, early spring vibe. And it's something about a home being built in rural Massachusetts and evolving over time, just perfectly complemented warm air coming back, longer days, early mornings where I get a sunrise while I'm walking the dogs. I just felt fully immersed in this book for the period in time that I was reading it. But it was kind of one of those, you read a review about it, you see the cover, you're never supposed to judge a book by the cover, but like the cover drew me in. Isn't that part of the point of them? And I was just like, I'm going to give this a shot. I don't know if I'm going to be able to make it through this because it seems really weird. But I'm going to try it out, and was fully engrossed.
Well, I read an interview by him, and Mason was saying that he got a fellowship from the Guggenheim and spent a year in New England, in Massachusetts. Actually, I think he was in upstate New York, but in the Berkshires, close to Massachusetts. And he wrote this book throughout 1 year, and the seasons align with how he was writing it. So he started writing it in June, and he wrote it all through the whole year. And every day he would write for a few hours, and then he would spend like 4 hours walking in the woods and like looking at what the different plants were and cataloging them on his phone. And you can feel that in this writing, in this book, this sense of being somewhere and knowing it so well and being so dense with it. And I think that's amazing. You recommended the book, and I read it in May, and the book starts off in late spring, early summer, like I mentioned. And it just, I felt very much like the sense of renewal and inevitability of time, which is a broader theme for sure. Which is, I think, something that's definitely one of the most important parts of the book, is just this idea that time goes on whether we like it or not, and that nature kind of has its way with us. And there's a quote at the end of the book that Nora, the botanist, says, and she says, "The only way to understand the world as something other than a tale of loss is to see it as a tale of change." And she's studying ephemeral spring plants. And I think that it's no surprise that he wrote her studying that, because she's studying these plants that only bloom in this moment before all of the leaves fill in the canopy. So it's early spring. And so he, I think, is really balancing this idea of the everlasting and the ephemeral, and that nature is constantly in a cycle of regeneration, and it's everlasting, but it's constantly ephemeral in this way that I think is incredible. And I've never really read a book that made me think so much about that. Was that a theme that stood out to you guys at all?
Absolutely. I mean, I think I think one of the big appeals of the book for me was the sense that so many books we read are character driven, and this book was almost anti-character, and we'll get into that. Like that wasn't really a thing that was a negative for me, but the point of the book is place, and is the ebb and flow of time and the ebb and flow of the seasons, more so than an individual family that lives in this house and what their experiences are like. It's more, how do they impact the land? How do they impact the house? But how does the land and the house kind of overtake them just by the fact that it exists for how much, how many years longer than people are going to live for? What about you, RJ?
I was thinking today about how similar this is to the bee sting, and totally different also. But like,
Okay, I want to hear more about that. What do you mean?
Well, I think the present being haunted by the past, like the haunting is a bigger
100%
theme for me than others, only because there's like the plot with its sisters is just so weird and freaky.
Yeah.
It's like really terrifying. But like I mean, it's totally different than the bee sting because of exactly what Brian just said, right? It's not about anyone really. The characters are like they're like they just die, and then it's almost like Covenant of Water, except like they're just people dying every time someone dies, and there's a new person, and I'm like trying to keep, like, someone got killed by an axe, and then someone like got eaten by a mountain lion.
Spoiler
I couldn't
alert.
like keep track of the people, but the idea that like everything that happens is, in addition to what you guys said about time, like it's haunted by that, what has happened before, which I think is really pretty interesting. And like the idea that like nature is dominant over man, which is basically like the idea, you guys know, like there's like the four kinds of books, right? There's like man versus nature, man versus man, man versus supernatural, man versus himself. That's a theory anyway, but most of the time the
I've
man
never
versus
heard
nature,
that. That's really cool.
I think that those are the four. Maybe there's more, but most of the man versus nature books, like man wins, right? Like survival tales or exploration. Like our whole country is founded on this idea that we can like kind of dominate the land. And in this book, it like flips the whole thing. And even there's like a part in the book where they talk about the apple and the apple seed and a dead person, and it's basically like the apple tree will like it basically like discards the body of the person, and the tree is what will last. So I think in some ways that's like really disturbing and haunting, along with like the characters that he does develop to be purposely like haunting. But it's I took a lot away from it. Like it's about a little bit more about yeah, like we don't really matter that much compared to the natural world, which reminds me of like the Overstory and books like that in that way. But the haunting is I thought it was like a crazy book to read in that sense.
Yeah, I think the haunting was a huge theme for me too. The idea of haunting and also regret. There's so many ghosts in this book. It evokes all of the great stories of like haunted houses in America. I think there's a lot of callback to that. I mean, just imagining what the homes in America have seen throughout the last hundreds of years is enough to keep your imagination busy for years. But I really love how he ties haunting to love, and how we haunt the ones we love and are haunted by the people we love. And one of the most meaningful stories for me is the relationship between the painter and his unrequited love. And I think there is this sense of that, like, love, even though there's this in kind of like, we are so insignificant, but he makes it feel like we're not, because love in his book can live past their time on earth. and they can be together as ghosts, and they can haunt places, and they can exist in the world even when they are no longer alive. And I think that that is a really hopeful way. I think that his idea of the afterlife is incredibly hopeful, which we can talk about later, I think, towards the end of the book. But the idea of haunting is crucial to this book.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that like it also adds an element of mystery and suspense that I was not anticipating based on the description of this book. And based on like the best ways I could describe this book throughout the year. I talked with a few people besides you guys about this book, and it was kind of one of those books that you just kind of smiled and were like, it was wild. I never read anything like this. And, you know, part of that comes from the fact that Mason just breaks with structure almost from the beginning, and your
Yeah.
expectations about how a story is supposed to unfold are completely decimated from, I don't know, page 15, when you're just jumping ahead 30, 40 years and you realize that the house is the main character here in a lot of ways. But I think that, and I don't want to give away too many spoilers here, but the idea of the haunting is something that returns throughout the book in a manner that almost aligns it with just like a really great airport mystery novel. And I don't want to belittle it, but like you get a sense of reward by the end of this book, that everything you read
Mm,
earlier has a connection to what you're reading later
totally.
on in a way that reveals itself in a manner I was not anticipating. I don't think I've read in any other in any other way. And it just blew me away. Like, and it gave this book an added element to it where it wasn't just we're passing through various owners who live here. There's a connection. And there's also this idea of some of the people that live in this house, there's ultimately no memory or reflection on who they are. They're just a story, period in time. And some of the people that live in this house and live on this land end up being, you know, generationally, over centuries impactful to what happens on this land. And it really gives you this kind of crushing sense of who matters, who doesn't matter. And sometimes it's not what you would predict, even when that person was alive. It has so much to do with what happens after their life.
Yeah, he's so good at that, like entangling stories and histories that hint back at each other in a way that is really complex. I mean, we talked last episode about the complexities of writing a book like The Bee Sting, but writing a book like this is really, really complicated too. There are so many stories in this book. Like I said, I read it a long time ago, last year in May, and I forgot how many stories there are in this book and how often they tie together. For example, like Nora, the botanist at the end, the last story, discovers paintings of trees from the painter before this early 19th century painter that showed these trees before the blight, right? The chestnut blight. And so he's ties, and there's a million moments like that in the book where he's connecting these stories in a way that's feels very authentic and effortless.
I think that I actually think that like the way in terms of the format, it kind of like not to take anything away from the writing because it's awesome, but the way that he saw it described as like more of a scrapbook of a novel.
Yeah.
I think that aspect actually like gives him a little bit more space to do what you're describing, which is like, there's like real estate listings and there's like, botanical illustrations. There's like things taken out of an almanac, it's like sort of like, it's a multimedia way of stitching the story together so that it's not all on like, now I have to remember to like tie this back to this. It's interesting. It's really, and it seems impossible to me, but I feel like that's almost like an aid in tying these things together but it like makes you feel disjointed, but I think it's actually like a good tool for bringing a lot of this stuff together.
I think that's a really great way of putting it. And I think, he also, the thing that he doesn't lose, which is remarkable based on the fact that you are kind of intentionally just getting snippets of people's lives and snippets of what happened. There's a murder early on in the book, which sets off a lot of different plot points as the book unfolds. And prior to that, before you realize where you're at, the book is a love story, and it's a
Mhm.
love story between two siblings, and one of those siblings then falls in love elsewhere. And so you really feel like you get into the heart of why one of the siblings wanted to have a little bit more freedom and wanted to break out of their own life, and why the other one was so fearful of it. And you get into these small elements of individualized stories that I think in less adept hands would have been really hard to do, and would have come across kind of clunky and almost like, well, you're just writing a scrapbook novel. But instead, here you get these really personal stories that could be stories completely to, like, it could be a novel completely to itself. But in the
Mhm.
service of what he's trying to do here, just gives you so much more depth and then allows you the opportunity to be swept away by the fact that time just keeps evolving regardless what you want or not.
Well, I think there's a real trust in the reader. I think anytime you're
Yeah.
going to go deep in one part with a story like those two sisters, but then you're just going to put a poem in or a story or a diary entry or a botanical journal, you're really asking the reader to decide what that means and where it belongs. And I've become really fascinated with this idea in art and how much an artist trusts the people who are reading the art. And I think the art that I like the most nowadays is art that encourages me to think and fill in the blanks. And this story really did that in a way that I think is just so incredible. And I hadn't really thought about that, RJ, about that it's a good tool for connecting the stories, but I think that's really true because it allows you to have to work to make the thread, which also makes it more meaningful. Like when you're told something, you don't think about it, but if you have to connect it yourself, it really is more challenging and also more it sticks with you more. And I do think that using this kind of scrapbook thing, it plays with this idea of archival, which I've mentioned earlier, but the more you think about this idea, you see it everywhere. But it's this idea too that objects live beyond us. And so, how do we stay connected to things or ideas from our past and how we hold on to people we love and how our love lives on with beyond us? And I think people don't know a lot of their history and everybody's collective memory is so short-lived now and technology encourages this communication and content that's timely and then just disappears. And there's a quote in the book and I don't even remember who says it, but someone says history haunts him who does not honor it. And I felt like there's a real kind of statement on present society and I think a lot about that because I read a lot of old letters that poets and writers write each other. I'm really into that. And often you realize what a gift it is to have these kinds of words or think about the book I'm reading by Jill Lepore right now, right? Like so much of this is based on artifacts that they have. Are we not going to have that? Like because we're all digital now and I think that there's something so romantic and old-fashioned and lasting about a paper trail. And I think he's really thinking about that and how important that is to history.
And at the risk of giving away any sort of the twist, part of the conclusion of the book is the fact that as we can capture images of place, I really want to tread lightly here because I don't want to say what happens, but as we can capture place and the ideas that someone has in their head, what is real and what is imagined really becomes a theme that takes over. And I know this sounds very convoluted to someone
Yeah.
listening to this who hasn't listened to the episode. So maybe can I give a spoiler alert and just kind of
I think
describe what
we
I'm
just got to
talking about
do
here?
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I think we got to do
So
it.
if you haven't read Northwoods and you're intrigued, I'm going to say something that gives away a massive amount of this book. So please, please, please pause this, fast forward like 5 minutes, and then come back to this. But, um, you know, I mentioned earlier, like the horror element, the twist element to this book that feels really well constructed in the way that,
Mhm.
like, again, like an airport novel would be, where you're just like, I just want something that like shocks me at the end in a well built up way. Um, one of the characters starts to kind of go crazy. He receives a lobotomy and he starts to hear things in the home. And he essentially has uh, as I understand it, a pathway to seeing the spirits that are still in the house.
Mhm.
And there are certain ghosts that have lingered in the house for centuries at this point in time. And it starts to drive him mad. And he starts to take pictures throughout the and I'm getting chills talking about this because I remember reading this like late at night.
It's
I
really
could not put it
spooky.
down. But he starts taking pictures around the property, around the land, in the house where he's seen the spirits. And it's his sister or his daughter who discovers these pictures, I
I think
believe.
it's his mom or his sister. His sister, I think. Yeah,
Yeah,
because he
because
doesn't
his
have
mom
kids.
put
Yeah,
him in
mhm.
the institute.
Yeah,
So
it's
it's
his
his
sister.
sister, and she's in the house looking at these pictures that have nothing. And she at some point realizes, and she gets clued into the spirits of the house and realizes that he was taking pictures of him seeing ghosts throughout the property.
So crazy.
It's so well done and it's kind of terrifying when it happens. It's probably the scariest thing I read all last year, but it adds this twist of like the people that are really in tune to a place are the people that are in some ways so far removed from what we consider reality. And you talk about like
Mhm.
archivalism and like, will anything that we have that we really care about right now be left from the digital world 200, 300 years forward? And you see that kind of balance here where this guy isn't actually taking pictures of something that is tangibly there, but it is there and he's documenting it. And it just gives you this mind altering perspective on place and reality and time that I could not get enough of.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that he really does like, I knew he kind of bends genre, but I hadn't really thought about how good he is at writing different genres. Like, think about the seance scene, like, that whole
Oh,
section of the book is hilarious. It's so hilarious, and it's almost like vaudeville, like, it's very extreme and over the top, but that's just as strong as this scary part or this kind of more American history part of, like, Osgood, and I don't know, he's really adept at changing kind of voices. He has such, like, a supple narrator voice, like, he's able to shift time periods, perspectives, characters really, really easily. The book is, like, just as serious as it is playful, it's just as funny as it is tragic. It's just this excellent balance of tone that shifts constantly, but doesn't leave you feeling reeling because he kind of earns it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like I mentioned this in comparison to the Bee Sting earlier, but because there's like the characters, I mean, you guys are kind of talking about the characters in a way that shows you connection you can have to them, but at the same time, you're not like nervous about what's going to happen at the end, like the Bee Sting. It's not like an anxious
Yeah.
it's sort of it is a little bit scary at points, like in a really good way, but you know, you're not like it's more of like you're just waiting to be guided to the end as opposed to like reading the Bee Sting where it was like just fucking stressful. So in that way, it's like a more
Yes.
more chill book
Less
to read,
anxious.
but still like very like so engaging. Yeah, it's the whole hunting thing is very it's like a huge part of it to me.
I have a question about the characters. I think some of the stories feel stronger to me than others. I don't know if that was true for you, or maybe some I was just interested in more than others. I got kind of bored in parts of the Osgood section. And I do wonder what the book would have been like if it was tighter and I don't want to say that, but has like each section was given more, or if he went further with certain characters, or if you needed that many. You know, I think one thing he does is like he builds such a rich world, which I think is a real mirror to a forest. You know, when you're in a forest, it's so dense, it's so overwhelming. There's a million sounds, there's a million feelings there, there's a million plants, and everything feels very dense. I spend a lot of time in these woods that he's describing, and there's a sense of enclosure and compactness, and like you could never see everything there. And there's so much that's out of your reach and that you can't see that's there, but you can feel it. And I think that maybe that's why he packs the book like this. But I don't know if either of you had feelings about that.
No, I mean, I was thinking about it because I mean, we talked about this last month. Like it was, for me, it was this and The Bee Sting were kind of 1A, 1B. And I think just structurally, this spoke to me a little bit more and hit me in that sort of manner. So like I was really grasping for flaws in this overall book, but I think you're absolutely right. I think there is a sense as you're passing through, and I think this is almost intentional, but writing in this
Mhm.
way, I think he gets to the point of writing about characters that you're not supposed to care about and that are not really supposed to
Yeah.
matter. I think he does it really well in the way that like even that Osgood section, like I found pretty fascinating. The seance scene that you're talking about that like was in a completely different tone from the rest of the book, but like I felt immersed in, even though I was kind of just like, this guy kind of seems ridiculous, and these seems like the type of people that are like almost abusing this home and abusing
Yeah.
like the land here. There's there's a story about a slave catcher who finds a devastating end, and it's early in the book where you're kind of just like, am I just going to read about a bunch of like shitty people that lived in this
Yeah.
house? And I'm going to have to like accept that, well, a lot of shitty people just end up living in houses. But I do think that part of the point was the fact that I said this earlier, like it resonated heavily with me. Some people who live in a home end up mattering and some people don't. And like you living your own individual life, you think that your life really matters and you think that what you're experiencing really matters. And this book, by allowing you to get away from an individual character that you follow through the book, and the house and the spirits within the book become more of the characters, it really gives you a sense of like, you're living in a place, you create these memories. Ultimately, those memories may just be yours and may not have any impact beyond your life. And so it's a flaw in a sense because you are asking people to read 20, 30 pages about characters that you may not actually care about. But also, like that structurally, I don't know how he would have accomplished this without introducing that throughout.
Yeah. And I think from a structural standpoint, it's 12 stories, right? And they all like generally
Was that it?
align
There are
with a
12?
month. Yeah. So I think that was like
Really? I didn't realize that.
so I mean, I think that that's he probably went in with that, like, this is how this is gonna,
Yeah. Each story is going to have a month.
yeah. But I think from a thematic perspective, like I think if you only had 3 stories, like, I think that without getting too, whatever, I feel like the stories are like layers of, in the forest, soil,
Yeah.
leaves, like
Yeah. Yeah.
every
I like
story
that.
is like its own layer. And when they're all like piled up, that's why the end with the botanist is so cool, because that's like it's connecting all those layers together. And I think if you had like four, if you did one per season or something instead of per month, like if it was like 4 main big parts, I wonder, maybe it definitely would have allowed obviously for more character development. I wonder if it would have been similarly impactful at the end. I don't know. I'm sure he
Yeah.
could have done it. But it also, with all these, like, it's kind of rambling like the house, so it's like there's just these kind of random points where it's like almost like you're in the back closet of the cottage and you're like, where the fuck am I? What are we doing here? Are we like going to get back to the main room? That's what it felt
Yeah.
like to me.
And you do kind of want to see, maybe the book wouldn't have felt as rich. And you also do kind of want to see the house change a lot, right? And if you only had 4 seasons, or you'd have to spread them out. And I think one thing that is fascinating about this book is when I picture this book, I always picture the part when the house is overrun and there's like the branches coming through the windows and there's like ivy everywhere. And I could almost feel it, like, when I don't remember which character it was, but who walks into the house, the woman that's living there alone, and she, like, walks into the house, and it's like there's, like, dust on the table, and, like, you can see the dust in the air, and, like,
Yeah.
there's this sense of, it's so evocative, and that to me is you're not gonna get that. You have to earn that, like, the sense of letting the house age and weather that way, and so maybe I'm talking myself out of this, but
No,
it
but I also agree with you. I think there were points where I was like, okay, like I'm ready for the next turn in the story. But I
there's
don't
some
think I'm
really
like,
random stories in there.
yeah, I think I'm like not whenever that happens to me, I feel responsible for it, you know?
Same.
Like
Yeah.
Sure.
I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah, yeah.
paying
Yeah.
attention or something. But
Yeah,
there were
yeah.
definitely points in this book when I was like, okay, let's move on to the next thing. Um,
I mean, I think that
but I
that
feel like
speaks
that's me as a
to.
reader.
I think that that speaks as well. We've talked about this with movies. It comes down to choice, you know, and you can only
Mm.
really make one choice unless you want to give like a here's a 1,000-page book and you can read the 400-page version of it, or you can read the full 1,000-page. Like the author made a choice that these stories are going to have a bit of speed to them. You're going to move through it, and then the whole point is almost kind of closing your eyes and imagining what the house and the land looks like in a like a flip picture book, you know, over 400 years basically. Um and I think that that choice ultimately works better than if you had spent 150 pages in each character's mind and you saw
Yeah.
slow like I think the speed of changes to the house adds to the drama of for certain 30, 40-year periods in time, this is a pristine, beautiful home in a gorgeous part of America that is, you know, representing what happens when settlers come through and really cultivate the land. And then for another 30 years, this house is completely forgotten and it's out of fashion and it has nobody is really tending to it. And then it comes back and it becomes like a high priced Airbnb at some point in time, you know, and really
Yeah.
like showcases how we you know how we try to celebrate land and homes in the current era by basically selling them to people for weekends at a time so that you can come and party there. And it gives you this real sense of like what was because I think, you know, in a lot of cases this book works well, not just as a fiction book, but as a American history book. And I don't
Yeah.
want to get into the debate of like historical fiction,
You know, they
but
call it
like it
historical fiction.
I'm sure that
Like,
they do.
yeah, yeah.
They have to. But like it does get to that sense of like you feel like you are reading like I think these truths that you talked about is a great compliment for this book because that tells you everything that archivally actually happened in America over the last 400 years. This tells you what happened in America via one small plot of land that ebbs and flows. And so, with that, like you can only spend so much time passing through certain characters' lives. So you don't get to know more than you'd want to. But the whole point there is that the house itself exists and the land lives on.
Yeah, it's so interesting. During COVID, I moved up to this part of the country and I lived there from March until September. And I had never spent every day there for that long. And I watched as every single day I watched the forest change. You know, it was COVID. I had nothing to do. I just walked through the woods and listened to HF Pod, like old HF Pod episodes. And I was watching every day the way the forest would change, and I could see it change almost daily. It was incredible. And I'd never seen like you go out one day and there's these tiny little twisted up, you know, green bulbs. And the next day they're like barely creeping out. And the next day they're unfurling. And you could really see it. It was like a flip book in that way. And I think that he created that sense in a way that is just, I guess you can only do it by having a story this big. And I think it's an argument for the way he did it because that is a sense that if you went out to try to write that way, that would be really hard to accomplish. But I think he was able to do it because he was actually in the forest every day and he was watching that happen. And I think that's just so incredible. And I think his ability to juxtapose the everlasting and the ephemeral, we talked about it a little bit before, but it made me really question, like, what is lasting and what does last forever? What's fleeting? He makes you question that, because there are things that you think about the story of the painter and this lover that he can't be with. You would think that their passion and their love is fleeting, but then he turns it into something that's everlasting. And I think that that's something that I want to talk about the end of the book, because I think the end is really tremendous and a huge accomplishment. And I think because it ties in this sense of something that exists for a short period of time, but that will always return. And I don't know that I've ever read a book that made me feel that way. So should we get into the ending?
Yeah.
Let's do it.
So the ending of this book, when I read it, I didn't realize, this is a huge spoiler. So if you have not read this book and you don't want to have the end be ruined, please stop. I didn't realize that Nora had died until the moment when she realized it. Did you
I was the same
realize
way.
it? You were?
Because her car goes in the ditch and then she
Yeah.
gets up and she walks out. And it was at some point, I'd have to go back and fully reread that chapter, but she starts to see these characters that you've seen throughout the book, and the house is in
Yeah.
like a very specific condition. And that realization of, I almost took it as like, you've been granted that you loved this house and you loved this land in the way that you were supposed to. It kind of brings you back to like the initial start of the book, when I think it's Osgood finds the apples and is like, I've never tasted anything like this in my entire life, and has a true love affair with the land in that specific place on Earth. And so you get almost a sense of, and it kind of goes back to what I keep thinking about, like, some people matter, some people don't, in the kindest way I can possibly say that. But like, you get a sense with this character that she really cared for the land and time and all the people that came before her, in a sense that she now gets to exist here for eternity. I'm curious if you guys had a similar reaction.
The moment when the truck lifts off the ground, and that's when she kind of realizes that she's dead, I was confused at how Osgood was there. I thought he was a descendant or something, and I didn't realize he was a ghost until that moment. And then they walk through the property together, and the painter, William Henry's there painting, and the canopy closes above them, and the forest kind of takes them in, and the smile would just not leave my face. And I was blown away by his ability to make me care about this woman who I'd literally met 2 pages ago, and feel like, right, like she deserved this, and because of her stewardship of the land and her understanding of it. And that just blew me away. But before I talk about the final chapter, I want to, RJ, get your feelings on that.
Yeah,
Did
I think
you know?
Yeah, just same as you guys. No, I think we were supposed to.
It's
I think
incredible.
we were supposed to figure it out when we figured it out.
But like,
Yes.
how often does that actually happen? Like, that's such a great writer's trick, and it fucking works.
It is. It is. It's like the M. Night Shyamalan movies, basically.
Yes. Like, when you don't realize it's a village, like, you don't
You're
realize
like,
that it's
oh,
like a big
these
thing, and then you're like,
people are
oh,
dead.
yeah.
You're like, ah. I mean, yeah, it worked. It worked. I think it worked exactly how it was supposed to. Yeah. I mean, it's a crazy way to end. I would like to reread that ending part too, but there's just, like you guys said, I mean, there's so much going on in this book. It's like a lot to remember. I mean,
It is a lot to remember.
I'll remember like the story of the twins the most, but they're also probably the most
dramatic.
Yeah, but they also like last the longest throughout the book. I mean, there's like little pieces of
Yes.
all the stories, but they keep coming back. Megan, I know you want to talk about the last chapter, but our incredible perp who's watching on YouTube says that there's a bunch of fish references in this book, including Split Open, Angry Mob, I saw you, and the character Anastasia, who was I think the person who could perform the seance, the medium fortune teller.
Mm.
The Silent
What do you guys think about that?
Trees,
Silent
Blue
Trees.
Stone, Luminous
Do you
Creatures.
think
Well,
Daniel
now we have to
Daniel
find
Mason's a
out.
fish head?
He might be a fan. He might be a fan. We need to find out. That would
Alright,
be a
we'll
real
It's so
twist.
it's so funny, and it's now making me want to reread this because I'm like, as Purpose saying this in the comments, I'm like, oh my god, I remember reading the book and
I remember
being like,
seeing one thing and just thinking
was
it
that
was
a
a
fish
weird brain.
reference? Like,
Yeah.
what is
I
going
remember
on
seeing
here?
Split Open. I remember that. And there's, yeah, I think just this idea of a house and a farmhouse at times too. I think, yeah, that's so funny. Well, fish fans will see that anywhere. Also, like we're a little bit crazy about that.
But I did
True.
get like to that
Not you,
extent,
Brian.
like the idea that they have as a band of like escaping to the woods of Vermont and creating
Yeah.
music and creating, art there. You got that sense with this house and, the broader Northeast. I'm curious for you guys, because I was thinking about this as I was preparing for this episode. If there's one character that you get a full book of, do you know who you'd want to read and why?
I
Meg,
mean,
let's start with you.
you can probably guess it, you guys. I completely subscribe to the most romantic notions possible. So yeah, I want to know about the painter and his unrequited love and how they exist past time together. Like, yes, that is right in my wheelhouse. So that's me. That's who I want. How about you guys?
What about you, RJ?
That's a good question. I guess probably like the schizophrenic guy who is like, who kind of made the whole thing even more creepy and weird than it already was.
That's a cool
I think
story.
the shortest I think was the writer. I feel like that was like a very short stint.
Oh yeah, I kind of forgot about that.
That could have been maybe right. That was the guy he like worked for a newspaper and wrote, and then he was like going to go and
the
write.
amateur sleuth.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, like that. I thought that part was cool, but only because it had like a very specific time, like kind of time, American history point of time associated with it. So one of those, I think. What about you, Brian?
Yeah, I'm torn between the two that you guys say, because I think that the unrequited love, you have like the makings there of one of the great love stories, and you already have the
Mhm.
setting, and you already have the reason why this can't actually exist in the current culture at this point in time. But then the schizophrenic character, I feel like you got the most backstory out of that, and I remember reading it
Yeah.
and kind of questioning, like, was the whole point of this book just to get up to this? And then the book, the structure of it kind of retook itself over. But his experiences in that land, and if you just dropped yourself into his life for 400 pages rather than all of these stories, I think you have a lot there that speaks to the power of place, speaks to losing your sense of grip on reality, and speaks to medical technology and lack of medical advancements in the early 20th century.
Well, and he's a psychiatrist, right? So he knows a lot about this stuff and writes about it really adeptly. And that was a cool one too, because you found out a lot about it. Almost took, I don't know if that was just 1 month, because it also, maybe it was, but it talked about his mom and then his sister too, right? Because she finds
Yes.
his records and his stuff, and she has to like go back. And so there was a bit of an extension to his story, which I think is really helpful to filling it out.
Great book.
One additional question I have for you guys, if I'm so allowed the time.
So allowed.
Megan, I think I know your answer, but I'd be curious if it was this or if it was different. RJ, I think I know your answer too, but is there a place that you guys have in this world where if you could get a book written about that specific plot of land, that specific home, all the people that live there, do you have a place that you'd love to see, over time, ebb and flow, what it was like? And if so, what would that be?
Yeah, it's basically this book. It's very weird. This house that I have in Massachusetts, I bought it, I guess, like 17 years ago, and it prior to us being there belonged to a family from New Jersey, and it was like built in the 60s and 70s as like a ski vacation home. And so it was very 70s. It had like dark paneled walls and like gothic fixtures, and there was a fire pit in the living room, like inside the living
Oh,
room,
yeah.
and an indoor grill in that went into the living room, like an indoor grill, like not like an outdoor, like indoor.
I'm here for it.
It's still there. It's terrifying. Now it's like a home for mice. But that place, the minute I set foot on this property, I had this like surge of emotion. And even though the house was in a state, I felt like it was a place that I belonged in. And so I think I would love to know what existed there before it. I would love to know what's going to exist after me there. I think there's such a romantic idea of a place that's really beautiful, and this is really remote and in the woods. So apparently this took place in Oakfield, Massachusetts. That's the exact town that he kind of based this on, which I believe is like 30-45 minutes from where I am. And I've never heard anyone describe the forest the way that he does. And so for me, it was such a gift to actually read a book like this that was about a place that I love, and had all these animals and all of the birds and the plants. And it was a real education for me on that place.
I love that. It's so cool that you got to like, you could actually see the plants, the animals that he's talking about, like feel the wind, the way that
Mhm.
is in that part of the, I don't know. That's amazing. What about you, RJ?
Maybe Big Sur, like, which is one of my favorite places in the
Oh,
country.
amazing.
Like, so, like the longest, basically the longest undeveloped coastline in the US, I think. But also like it's beautiful and interesting, but it's also just like, it's kind of like this part of the country that Northwoods is about. There's so much of it on the other side of the highway that's just woods, and like who knows what's happening back there. Like I think it's got like a mythical kind of reputation and standing in America. It's like you drive down Route 1 and you're like, I cannot believe this exists. But also like there's so much of it that's undeveloped and untouched. And I mean, God knows what's going on in there. I mean, that would be like something to explore.
That's amazing. Aren't there secret roads that are like through that area of the country that are shortcuts to other places that people can't confirm if they exist or not? I've heard that. I don't know if that's true.
I don't know about that.
I
mean,
heard-
I've been there a lot, and I don't know of any, which is sad. Wish I could
Well,
tell
I think
you one.
maybe I'm wrong, but I was reading a Joe Didion book this summer or last spring, and she was talking about that. I'm going to look that up and send it to you.
Okay.
Yeah,
That is awesome. Yeah.
I might be wrong.
I mean, that part of you're probably right. That place is like, I mean, it's just, it's massive, but also like just insane. That's my answer.
How about you, Brian?
I love it. So my family used to rent a house in Door County, Wisconsin every summer, right on Green Bay. And it was built in the 1860s. And we went up there probably 9-10 summers in a row, late July, early August. And, this is very much a house that like in the mid 90s was in the peak of family rentals for a week period in time. And it was very cramped, and every step you took, you heard the entire house shift. And it was on this, hillside that went down into Green Bay. And, Door County is kind of like the Cape Cod of the Midwest, and has really nostalgic vibes. And the cool thing about it is you can be in a downtown area that's just packed with people walking to, stores, to restaurants. There's a lot of activity out on the waterfront, but then you can be in a cabin 10 minutes away from civilization, and it's just total silence. It's beautiful. And I basically grew up going there through the summers. And then sometime mid high school, as I was growing up, as my brother and sister were growing up, we just stopped going there. Our lives just got too complicated to make that a regular thing. And I probably haven't been back there since 2001, 2002 at this point in time. And over the years, we've talked about it randomly as a family and just been like, oh, that was such a great house and shared memories. But at some point, I think my dad found out that they just stopped renting it. And last year, he found out that the house is back up for rent on a weekly basis.
No
And
way.
and we're trying to figure out now how to get the whole family out there. With, now with spouses and kids, it would be incredibly cramped, but figuring out a way to get us there. Because for me, like going back there, like I can picture every part of the house. I can picture every part of the property, um, just as I envision it. But going back there would almost be like this experience of seeing a house being built and then going back 30 years later, and however much has changed, however much has stayed the same. What of my memories are actually real? What of them I've kind of like created throughout this period in time? So I don't know. That's kind of I thought about that, and I thought about that part of the country as I read this book, just in the relationship I had to both a home but also the natural world there.
Oh, the Midwest summers. My best friend growing up had a house on Grand Haven, and it was an old
Mm.
family cottage that like her great grandparents had built by hand. And it was just, I spent a couple summers out there and it was so unbelievable. Like the sleeping porches and playing cribbage and the thunderstorms at night and the
Oh,
walking in the lake and, being on a tube in a speedboat for the first time. And yeah, there's just Midwest summers. So
nothing like it.
romantic. I love it. Okay, before we head out, I do just want to talk about the last chapter very quickly. It's called Succession, which I think is interesting. And I reread it last night, and I would recommend anybody that hasn't read it in a while reread it. It's a complete dream. To me, it's just packed with an emotion that I have never felt and didn't really want to end. He really talks about this idea of like what might lie beyond for us, and it's really about Nora experiencing this land and this property as a ghost and being able to do all the things she's ever wanted to do and bear witness as nature moves through time, and how we're inconsequential and consequential in time, and how nature just keeps on moving without us, and the beauty and the kind of sadness inherent in that. And the ending made me feel really sad, but I didn't really know why. It also made me feel really hopeful. And the last line of the book is, and then it begins again. Because if you remember, like the house, it burns down in a huge fire. And then it's like there's a moment when all the ash is like floating. And then he says, and then it begins again. And I was like, this is the most perfect ending to any book.
I think he nailed so many aspects of the experiment he was making structurally, and I think that it almost speaks to like this takeaway I kept having of like some things last, some things matter, and other things just simply fade away. And so part of this home, it turns to ash, but this property is going to be ideal for building another home, and for offering more memories. And so there's this cautionary tale of humans taking over a place, caring for a place, but also being a part of the death and rebirth of a place.
Yeah, I mean it's crazy. The ending is definitely like he figured it out. I wonder if he knew that going in. I bet he probably did. Don't you think?
He strikes me
Kind
as
of
someone
had
who
to know.
planned out a lot of the
I
book.
agree. Yeah,
Yeah.
it seems that way.
And then figured out where the thread is between points, and the
Yeah.
thread itself is where the magic lies. Because
Yeah.
he hits these plot points, and he hits these things he's trying to go after, and they're in and of itself really creative and really well thought of, but it's how you get there that ultimately is the magical part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I'm curious if he read Marquez or if he's influenced by him, because there's so much in that, this magic realism, this like romantic ideals, this idea of haunting, and the ending of 100 Years of Solitude, it parallels this book as well. So curious.
The only it's crazy to go from a book like Bee Sting to a book where the only characters are nature and time.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
know, right? It's like the opposite.
It's really pretty wild. Big contrast.
Can I make one recommendation before we go?
Please.
Yeah.
So we try to do this. Like, what book would you recommend
Mhm.
someone to read?
Yeah.
I'm gonna zag here because I don't have a recommendation of a book. I have a movie recommendation, which probably breaks down
Oh,
all
cool.
rules of what this podcast is built around.
We get to decide
But
the rules, Brian.
we do. This is our show. I recently watched the movie Here that came out back in October. Slightly controversial pick because in some corners of the universe, this movie is derided as just the most well, it's a Robert Zemeckis movie, so there's a bit of like that emotional gut turning slop that you get. But the thing that gets me about this is that the entire movie is shot in one single frame of the world, and the entire movie is shot in that single frame, and you go as far back as the creation of the earth and the dinosaurs all the way up to the present. And you spend a lot of time with a family that lived there from just after World War II up until the mid 2010s. And the movie flashes back and forth between other people who lived in this home and what has happened to this home since this family left and why this family left. And it gives you a real sense of kind of sadness that this book gave me as well, but also structural freedom in a way that I absolutely love, that your experiences in a place mean everything to you, but do they last? And why do they
Mhm.
last? And what about them last? And what things that you think will last don't actually end up lasting? And so I would say if anyone has not read this book, somehow made it through this without getting spoilers, but wants to either read this book or get a sense of like, what is this book like in a film setting? The movie Here will give you as close of a relationship to what this is like structurally. And I think both from a structural risk standpoint, accomplish more in their medium than a lot of other things I've either read or watched. But it really just it restructures the way that you think of a character in a book from a person, or a movie from a person to a place and to an idea of place that I just absolutely loved. And I would love to consume more of this, but I get why people don't really take these risks, because they
Yeah.
are really challenging to be successful at.
Really hard to pull off, but I'm going to watch that. You recommended that. I'll watch that. That sounds really cool.
Yeah, it's on my list. I mean, I have
The
a
only-
list of movies. I'm never going to watch them, but I'm there. I have a list. That's all that
We
matters.
send you movies anyway. The book, I actually have a couple books, but the book I decided that I want to share, it wasn't on my original list, but as we've been talking, I've been thinking a lot about it. Have you ever read Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier?
No, I
First of all-
haven't.
First of all, that should be on both of your lists. That book is fucking amazing. And it's about a really strong sense of place, but it's about this woman who marries this man, and there's a really big haunting in this book, and it has this incredible sense of setting and mystery and darkness, and it's scary and it's sad and it's really beautiful. It's one of my favorite books. It's an excellent book, and it has a real sense of place and magic, and I would definitely recommend that if people haven't read that book.
I mentioned the Overstory earlier, which is,
Yeah.
thematically similar. I think the other book is Trust. I think it's actually pretty similar to Trust in that sense.
That's fascinating. I hadn't thought
You
about
know?
that.
Like it's like building on the history that's building, and you're hearing it from different perspectives and using different mediums of writing to get to different parts of the same story.
Yeah, that
That's
book
what
is
it reminded me of. That.
cool. Like didn't like parts of reading that book, and I continue to think about that book still. So
Yeah,
I think
same.
it's really fascinating and challenging, but also really smart, really cool book. Well, next episode, next month is a little bit of a controversial pick. We're going to be reading a book that I loved called Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro from 2021. And definitely not my usual bag. I would say I don't usually read dystopian science fiction. You can probably tell from my recommendations what I love. But this book is so different from the books we've been talking about. It is so sparse, it's so economical. It is talk about trusting the reader to make the connections. This book does it. Thinking about the parallels between humanity and AI, it's fascinating. And I'm excited to discuss this book and get into it. And we'll talk about that in February when we come back. Anything you guys want to say before we head out? Brian, are you
Well,
so excited to talk about Clara?
I just want to say I liked it too. Why do you say you liked it? You left
RJ
me
liked
out.
it too. You did.
I'm
Thanks,
just setting up
RJ.
I'm just setting up the battle between us and Brian for next time.
I've got you on my team.
Only if you need me.
I am incredibly excited about this episode for two reasons. One, we have talked about three books that we all collectively loved. And so there is a shared sense of, well, I loved this about it. Oh, well, I loved this about it. Oh, well, I loved this about it. And then we just kind of go around in circles. And it's great for us to just be like, hey, all of you out there listening, please read these books. They impacted us heavily. There's also something I think that we talked about at the top of this with regards to ranking, that some things work for some people and some things don't work for others. And the fact that we're going to be able to get into that debate of why did this choice work for you? Why did it not work for me? And vice versa. I think it's going to be really fascinating. But the other reason I'm really excited about this, I've said this in other, places in the podcast world, there is nothing I love more on this planet than being feeling like I'm wrong about something and learning another side to it. And I will be outright, this book did not work for me in a lot of ways. Some parts of it did, but overall as a whole, it did not. And to hear what worked for you guys and to dive deep thematically into various plot points, into various areas of the book that really hit you guys, I think it's going to be revealing for me. And I think I'm going to walk away from it, hopefully understanding a little bit more of what hit you and what would hit a different reader as well versus where I'm at. And so I can't wait for both of those things. I think it's going to be an engrossing conversation. And, it's going to probably kick off a new series on Library Card where one person has to defend a book
Yeah.
that they like and the others
Great.
just attack it.
Let's do
Oh,
it.
I love that. That'd be so
I'm ready.
fun. Terrifying,
See you
but
guys there.
fun.
See you guys there.
All right. Well, I just want to thank everyone who's listening and who's been reading along with us. It's been so fun. We're going to read Clara for February, and it's a short book, so you can definitely read that between now and our next episode. So thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next month.